Well, welcome back, everybody.
We got nothing.
And I'm in the home stretch. This is kind of nice. I'm losing my oomph. Need a little bit more passion. Oh, that helps. So, just real quick, I think the SD's panel broke the record for the most tweets. There it is, right there.
Whoa. Thanks.
I say that now as a challenge to Michael.
How many tweets was it?
Yeah, he knows. That's right. Well, it is hard to believe, but we've almost come to the end of the conference, and I hope everybody's enjoyed it and learned as much as I have through the process. I know there's a bunch of things I'll be stealing, plagiarizing, and taking home and trying to do in Ohio. So our last general session is on the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones. I know that Chris doesn't like us to call them drones. We want to call them UASs because the S is a system, and that implies a certain amount of control over it. So I listened, Chris. I just want you to know. So we do have an ARS question for our state government attendees. The use of domestic aircraft vehicle systems, UAS, I'm not going to say that word, in state government is growing. Data management, security, privacy, and safety are all policy issues that must be addressed. Characterize the CIO's role with respect to your state's use of UAS. I don't know if I can vote up here. Am I allowed to?
No, you can't vote, Stu.
Okay. Oh, I was supposed to read the rest of that, wasn't I?
No, they
See,
can
it's good that it's almost over. So I'm losing my attention span. Not on my radar. Well, I got news for you guys.
Uh-oh. Changing that.
Yeah, you better be thinking about this one because it's coming one way or the other. So the same question was asked a year ago at NASCIO, and we had 36.5% of the respondents said drones were not on the radar screen, so we at least moved forward a little bit. That's some progress.
Does that surprise you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, particularly given.
So today is very different, and while the discovered uses for UASs increases, so do policy issues. The next general session will discuss the future of UAVs. Yes, UAVs, and address the related data management, security, privacy, and safety issues. Please help me in welcoming Michael Cockrell, who is going to facilitate the discussion, and he's the CIO for the state of Washington. And we also have Kevin Promfit, and I'm sure I'm going to screw up all the names, so you got to bear with it. It's just like a tradition now, so I almost have to do it at least once. So Kevin is the executive director for the Center for Spatial Law and Policy, and we have Andrew Konashevsky.
You got it.
And he's a partner at CLS Strategies. So welcome these guys. And I have to
let
go.
the tweets begin.
I have to sit down so that I can take notes. So you have to wait till I get to my seat.
All right. Thanks, Stu. Okay. I think we're here today because, in my opinion, there are really only two issues that we deal with in IT that are kind of raised to the level of public policy issues. You know, we talk about cloud, we talk about the Internet of Things, we talk about mobility, and those are all crucial things that we have to deal with day to day. But cybersecurity and information policy, or information privacy, have a different characteristic, and the key difference in my mind is that people are making laws about them. And it's part of our role to understand the technology and understand the limitations and their strengths so that we can help set that public policy. Because these aren't IT policy issues, these are high-level public policy issues. So as technologists, it's our role to support the actual policymakers so that they're making the right laws and making the right policies. And that's why we're talking about drones today, because drones are the touchstone around the privacy issue. There are 39 states right now that have either passed or are considering passing some kind of drone legislation. And you got to remember that according to the FAA, unless you get this special exemption, commercial use of drones isn't, well, until recently anyway, commercial use of drones isn't even legal. So you have 39 states out there making laws about a technology that functionally doesn't exist. So you kind of have to ask yourself, why? What's going on in that context? So I had the rare pleasure of chairing a committee that, on the governor's behalf, that wrote some drone legislation. And so I got the opportunity to understand some of those issues and learned about their background, et cetera. And so the goal today is to try and expose some of those issues to you and give you a feel for kind of both sides of the issue. So that's what Kevin and Andrew are here to help. They're going to help us lead a discussion on the issues, answer your questions, and hopefully what we're going to do up here is sort of illustrate the debate that is going on in houses and senates all over the country so that you get a little bit more context and you understand the landscape, because this issue is coming to you soon. And so what we really want to be able to do is give you the context so that you can be productive and add your voice to it. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to ask Kevin and Andrew to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about what they do and what each one of their organizations does. And then I'll give you a little bit more background. And then we're going to go through a very specific scenario, and we're going to use that scenario to try and illustrate the issues. And it's at that point, I know everybody who sits in this chair says it, that we want your input and questions, et cetera, but this is only really interesting if you guys raise your hand and throw out questions in context, because they're complicated issues, and they have to do with stuff that we're not used to, but that we really need to understand so we can make great policy decisions. So, Kevin, can you start and give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me speak. As Michael said, I am Kevin Pomfret. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Spatial Law and Policy, and I'm also an attorney, and I advise businesses and government agencies on some of the unique and legal issues around geospatial information, the data that's collected that's tied to a location. And that we started the center about 5 or 6 years ago because you could see this technology developing. I started out as a satellite imagery analyst back in the mid-'80s. All of those systems were classified, but that was sort of my exposure to this technology. And when you started to see Google Earth and GPS and smartphones, you could see these issues evolve. So if we could go to the next slide, I do have a couple of slides that I do want to sort of highlight. One of the points I wanted to discuss is sort of, I think it's important to think about this discussion around drones in terms of the larger context of what's going on around privacy and location. So here's a picture that was taken in St. Peter's Square. Actually, it's backwards. That picture was taken in 2008 in St. Peter's Square, and it's in connection with the death of one of the popes. And you can see a bunch of people waiting quietly, looking around. This was before the iPhone. All right. If you go to the next slide, this is in 2013. This is the same perspective, different pope, and again, people are waiting. And you can see, everyone is tweeting their location, they're taking pictures, they're sharing it with everyone else. They're giving their location away in all these different ways. But I would argue that the privacy paradox is such that they expect more privacy in 2013 than they do in 2008. And that's a real challenge because technology is moving so quickly and the legal community is still trying to get the Second Amendment right? So we're struggling with how to deal with these issues. And that's the larger context that drones or UAVs are part of. So when you say why do we have so many legislatures that are worrying about privacy concerns, because they're worried about a lot of privacy, with drones, they're worried about a larger privacy concerns with a bunch of different technologies. And this is one that's really spearheading the effort. Another thought that I would have is that I think that what I see in the community is law enforcement and government agencies want to be able to use UAVs and are trying to minimize the privacy risk for themselves, but when the commercial side tries to do it, there's a great deal of concern about privacy and safety. I'm not sure you can have it both ways. I think if you see the benefits of government and using it for law enforcement, you're also going to have to see the benefits of the commercial side. And I see that tension in a lot of legislatures in terms of restricting one or the other. And then the third piece is, and this is sort of a broader perspective, but if we start changing what's considered a reasonable expectation of privacy in a public space, if we start limiting what information you can collect about people when they're out in public, I think that's going to have a dramatic impact on a lot of areas of our existing law. And I'm not sure we're giving that enough thought. So I think, for instance, a number of defense lawyers will go back and look at their cases and say, you know, how many of my clients were put in jail because there was some information that was collected them in a public place that shouldn't have been. So it's things like that that I think we need to think of in the broader context.
Thank you. Andrew?
Thank you, and thank you very much for having us here today. I think this is a fascinating topic. Drones, I've been working on drones, and I'm going to just use the D word because sometimes it's easier, for about 3 years now. I'm a consultant to the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International. There was a lot of alphabet soup in the introduction, and this is another one here. But basically, AUVSI is the association that represents, among others, manufacturers as well as software developers and other component providers to the industry. Kevin talked a little bit about the broader privacy context. I'm going to kind of broaden the context even further to outside of privacy. I'm not a IT expert or even a lawyer or a privacy expert, but I've been working on this technology for about 3 years now, and the privacy issues are certainly always in the forefront and important, but also important are the applications of this technology, the ways in which various public agencies, commercial operators are looking to use them for everything from infrastructure surveys to agriculture to scientific research. The uses are just limitless and very, very, very interesting. There are things that are popping up every single day that some of us who have been working on this technology haven't even contemplated. 60 Minutes did a piece on the overall industry about 1.5 years ago, where at the very end they even suggested that you could use small drones to walk your dog because dogs like to chase them. So, it's kind of a high-tech version of the Frisbee. But in addition to the good uses, there's a huge economic story here. And I think, and all of these things are interrelated, because as we think about various efforts to potentially restrict the technology and/or its uses, there could be unintended consequences for the economic impact of this industry and its job creation potential. AUVSI back in 2013 put what is to date the most authoritative and forward-looking economic impact study together on the UAS integration, and found that over the first decade, the industry is likely to create about $82.1 billion in economic impact and 103,000+ jobs or so. I had one slide I just wanted to show, because what I did wanted to finish on very quickly is just talk a little bit about kind of where the industry is when it comes to privacy. And first and foremost, which I think possibly some of you may be in agreement here, or maybe not, and we should talk about it. I'm really curious to get your questions. But the industry sort of comes at the issue from the standpoint of it's important. Obviously, it's a worthwhile discussion to have. Importantly, feels that the more appropriate question, though, is less the platform and more the collection, the sharing, the retention of data, and that it's erroneous in some ways to focus purely on the platform, because there are so many other things that collect data, that share data, and Kevin mentioned your smartphone, which perhaps is the device that is most violative of your privacy. A couple of other things worth mentioning, and this is particularly acute because right now we're in the process of the early stages of a rulemaking that will put the rules in place for commercial use. And for commercial operators, at the very least, the industry is supportive of registering and marking platforms. So that's one transparency measure that at least will allow folks to track back a platform to a particular operator in the event of misuse, or in the event that someone maybe flies a commercial drone on the White House lawn again. Let's hope that doesn't really happen. And it's worth saying that obviously anyone who does violate existing privacy laws or misuses the technology in an inappropriate fashion, industry certainly supports clamping down and cracking down on them and holding them accountable. We want to see this technology used for good. There are a lot of very, very beneficial applications. There's a huge economic impact. No one really wants to see it misused because, and I think everyone in the industry is very cognizant of the fact that a few bad actors have the potential to ruin it for everybody when there are a lot of good uses and good things that could come of it. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Michael.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that's the stage. You got private industry expertise, you got a legal expert, and then you got me impersonating the government perspective. So let me just answer a couple questions right off the bat, which is, why aren't we talking about the FAA? You're talking about unmanned aircraft. What's the deal with the FAA? Aren't they going to regulate it? And the answer is yes, they're going to regulate it. But what the FAA is going to do, and there's 1,000 nuances, but basically the FAA is going to say, hobbyists, you can fly at this altitude, commercials, you can fly at this altitude and with this space, and if it's above that, it's satellites and spaceships and airplanes. What they're not going to do is say, you can't use this technology for information gathering, or you have to do data minimization when you take video, or all of that is policy stuff that we at the state level are going to have to deal with. The feds may have some general policy about privacy, et cetera, but generally that's a state's issue, and that's one of the reasons why 39 states are writing laws right now. So the FAA is a major player, and some of the state of where they're at hopefully will come out in this discussion, but they're not the part that we have to care about that much, because they're going to be focused on the mechanics of it, and where the big issue here is on the data collection and use and minimization and the policy issues that come with that. Okay, so I have a belief that the reason that this is happening right now, well, first of all, that personal privacy is the next frontier in civil rights. It's a bold statement, but think about it for a little bit. Who can do what with my digital persona, with the information about me? What can the private industry do with that? What can government do with my digital persona? How is it protected? Who can look at it? How is it gathered? Those are all questions that have not yet to be answered. And in the boldest way, that's the next frontier of really fundamental human rights. Pew just came out with a study, actually I saw it 2 days ago, that said 91% of people surveyed believe that consumers have lost control of how their personal data is collected and used. So you got 91% of people basically saying, this is the next frontier and I don't feel like I have any control. So what we're seeing here is the American public kind of drawing a line in the sand and saying, drones is it. This is the issue that we're going to sit and fight about. We've been ignoring the fact that there are poll cameras in traffic and that there's satellite surveillance and that the government and private industry collects information about us for a long time now, and right now this is the issue. And it doesn't really have that much to do with drones. What you're seeing is kind of a groundswell of the public saying, we've gone too far. So I'll give you a real world example. In Washington, last year, we had a drone law. It was written by strange bedfellows. The ACLU and the Tea Party got together. No joke. And they basically came out with a law that said, functionally, government agencies can't use drones except when there's a forest fire or if there's so they said you can't do it except in these cases, and in these cases you have to disclose if you catch personal information, and it was very onerous. It basically made it so government agencies couldn't use drones. 143 out of 149 legislators voted for that law. And when I went and asked some of them, basically what they said was, you know, there's none of them in the room, so I can say this. We didn't really pay that close attention, but our constituents did. We got tons of calls. This was the issue that we got all the calls that the public was getting involved in. So that's the context. This isn't really about drones. It's about the American public saying, we've gone too far, privacy isn't important to us, and this is the issue that we're going to care about. So now you've got 39 states that are, I'll give you another example. There was a law in California that came to the governor's desk that said the police can't use drones at all without a warrant. And again, giant support from the public. But when you start to think through that, I mean, the amount of public safety you can get without putting officers at risk, et cetera, is really big. And the issue is being dealt with a big hammer. The governor vetoed that, and his veto note said, it's too far reaching, period. Not quite that, but basically he said, look, we've just gone too far. We have to be more thoughtful in the way that we deal with public policy. So that's the context that we're operating in, and that's why we're talking about this otherwise weird issue at NASCIO, is because personal privacy is a big issue, and people are making laws about it, and we have a responsibility to be able to help our legislators make the right kind of policy. So I'm going to stop there and invite questions, comments, try and get the audience involved. Is it going to work? Anybody? Anybody?
This one over there.
Yeah, please.
If you look at all the video cams that are out there, you know, people wearing them on their head, on their dashboard of their car, I mean, we're collecting all sorts of information today. So I kind of wonder how much more, I mean, there's more information, but people have kind of given up their privacy based on all this technology already. I mean, I think we got to manage it, but we've kind of all given away our information. We put it on LinkedIn, we put it on Facebook, where, you know, I kind of find it interesting that the drones have become the thing because everyone's already put all their data out there. To me, the bigger issue right now is not the privacy issue. To me, because I think people mentally hear drone strike, people getting killed in different countries, I think there's more paranoia about what are these drones flying up in the sky? Even though there are very tremendous uses, right, in agriculture and so many different areas, logistics, et cetera, that you can see a strong ROI. But I think that fear, that paranoia, to me, is more worrisome than the fear of the data privacy. That would be my thought.
I think that's a great point. And in fact, it's fear that is driving it, right? If these weren't called drones and people used their correct names, and we talked about this as UASs, we would not be having this conversation.
And I think that's what, you know, the industry confronts on an almost daily basis, which is you have states primarily, there's been some federal legislation, but it really isn't going anywhere, it hasn't, you know, regulating hypotheticals based on paranoia. And that's really, really challenging when you're trying to have a reasonable, rational discussion about the capabilities of the platforms, what they can and can't do, you know, existing laws and legal framework and what it may or may not allow. Because the fact is, you know, particularly for what we're talking about with regard to the FAA integration, we're talking about small drones under 55 pounds, many of which can't hover 24 hours over a person or a piece of property, even if they wanted to. Most of them have flight durations anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half tops, and then they have to come back and swap out the batteries or recharge. And a lot of the users of the technology really only want to use them for very, very specific operations. You know, early on, right after the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 passed in February of 2012, this is what kind of paved the way for the integration of the technology and gave rise to a lot of the drone coverage in the news. A lot of the concern was with the law enforcement community. And the law enforcement community, if you talk to a lot of folks in the law enforcement community, they say we don't want to hover these over people's houses. We want to keep one in the trunk of the car so that, you know, if we need to photograph an accident scene, You know, we have that capability there, but it's kind of like the shotgun that we keep locked up, you know, pointed toward the roof up front, which is to say we hardly ever use it, but we want to just know that we have that capability if we need it. And to the credit of the law enforcement community, the International Association of Chiefs of Police came together and put voluntary guidelines together for law enforcement agencies around the country that actually did address warrants. It addressed data collection, retention, basically you know, recommended seeking out warrants if you believe there's a reasonable belief you're going to collect evidence of criminal wrongdoing. And to some extent, I think that helped cool the temperature down a little bit, but it's a great point, and it's a challenge for the industry, it's a challenge for the technology when sensationalism and hysteria is kind of guiding the legislative and regulatory process as opposed to ration and reason. And I just want to say one final thing, which is I agree with Michael's comments that, you know, drones have become sort of the tip of the spear of this debate about personal information and privacy, but I'm still trying to figure out my Facebook privacy settings. I'm a little bit more worried about that.
But that's because you're rational. I mean, one of the interesting things about everything you said is that it's true, and it, at least in Washington, didn't make any difference at all in terms of the debate. The debate was, yeah, you say that now, Sheriff, but what happens when I have a matrix of 400 drones flying over the city keeping track of everybody next Tuesday? We need to make a law to stop that right now.
Yeah, just a couple of points I wanted to, on what Michael said. I do agree that the states have been taking a lead from the privacy standpoint and restricting drone use, and I agree with Andrew that it's somewhat anticipatory since you haven't been able to use them for commercial purposes until quite recently. And you know, the use by law enforcement government agencies has been somewhat limited as well. I do think the federal agencies, the federal process is going to get involved. And when the notice of proposed rulemaking went out for the FAA for commercial use of UAVs, at the same time the White House issued an executive memorandum that put some requirements and limitations on how government agencies could use UAVs, and told them to go out and to develop policies to protect not only privacy but civil liberties and civil rights. And those also flowed through to the contractors. So training requirements, audit requirements. So I would look at the federal government because there are going to be policies and best practices that may develop out of that. In addition, there has been a lawsuit against the FAA because the FAA has not included privacy in its Section 333 exemption process. I'm not sure that's going to go anywhere, but it still hasn't come to an end. And then with respect to people's concerns about UAVs, as I said in my talk in the first two slides, it is part of a larger context, and I do think that people are being concerned about it, but I don't think that it's to the point where we can just ignore the fact that it is applying to UAVs. And as we were talking earlier, people, if you're a policymaker, if you're a legislature, you don't get benefit by saying, okay, we're going to apply trespass or peeping Tom laws or privacy laws, of which there are very few in the United States at any level, frankly. You don't apply, we're going to apply those to UAVs. You make a name for yourself by coming up with I'm going to protect my citizens against UAV privacy law. And that sort of frames the discussion going forward, and that's the challenge that I think a lot of you will have. And I think part of that is because, and to the credit of Andrew's organizations, because they have such tremendous value. They could be so disruptive. And so people see those numbers and hear those numbers and they see what it can do. I mean, the 60 Minutes report that was discussed, I gave a talk back in March of 2000, last year in March, to a bunch of lawyers, and we talked about UAVs and the hypothetical. Well, we were just seeing the pace that was picking up, and it was partly because people were talking about the Amazon Jeff Bezos interview, and was he serious, and could this really happen? It's coming, and people are going to be worried about this and how you're going to do it, and so that's why I was a little bit surprised when 50-something% of you said that it wasn't on your radar, because I see it in a lot of different ways coming next year, 2 years, as being a very common data information source.
So, Kevin, you just used two words that I think are really useful for this next piece: hypothetical and anticipatory, right? That that is how people are making laws right now, based on scenarios that may or may not ever happen and assumptions that may or may not be true. So I thought we would just continue in that vein and make up a hypothetical scenario and then try and dissect it relative to the way our current laws are and our current technology. So I took the liberty of writing up a scenario here. I'll try and I'm going for drama, so I got to read it. So, tucked up 18 miles up a treacherous trail in the Wenatchee National Forest, of course it's a Washington scenario, is the Enchantment Lakes. They're beautiful. So the Department of Natural Resources wants to keep track of the trail that goes up there. So they are, some hypothetical time in the future, DNR has decided that they're going to use drones to map the trails and gather a bunch of information along the trail, right? So they hire this contractor, and the contractor is going to take a matrix of quadcopters, 16 quadcopters, and they're going to fly them starting from the trailhead, fly them over the length of the trail, and they're looking for 4 things. First of all, they want to create a video baseline so that they can understand how much impact hikers have, right? DNR cares about that kind of stuff. They also have equipped these drones with LiDAR cameras so that they can look at erosion along the path, right? Because we just had a big landslide. We care a lot about erosion. We care a lot about keeping track of that. They also want to know exactly where the issues are on the trail because they've got to send rangers up to fix them, to fix the trail so that they can start to sell permits for people to go back to this beautiful land. And then the last bit is agriculture. Department of Agriculture has said, hey, if you guys are going to be up there, we want you to measure the snowpack on Asgard Pass because we care about it relative to the amount of water that Wenatchee and the Yakima Valley are going to get. So mundane but very real scenario. This is the way people would really use drones. So the contractor gets up to the parking lot and they lay out, they're kind of surprised at the number of cars that are in the parking lot because no permits have been sold. But they don't care, they're contractors, and so they lay out their drones and they take off. This mesh of drones is taking off over the trail. While they're taking off, the cameras are running. So they just capture the license plate of all those cars. And as they're flying over the trail, their cameras are going both backward and forward, and they actually are going in 360 degrees. And so if there are people on the trail, which of course there are, which is implied by the cars in the parking lot, they're going to capture the people on the trail as well. Facial recognition is fairly trivial. I now have the license plate, I have a face, I can tell who that person is. So that's interesting. The drones keep flying over, and they also capture a illegal marijuana grow right off the trailhead. Of course, it's Washington, so we have to add the rejoinder that it's an illegal marijuana grow. Contractors still don't know. The drones fly up over Asgard Pass. They get to Lake Louise. They're taking video. They also capture video of another couple on the trail doing things that the couple wouldn't normally do if they knew the DNR were taking pictures of them. So this unmanned set of drones gets all that data, brings it back to the DNR. DNR looks at the data, and they find all this stuff. They find that they've captured personal information. They find that they've captured illegal grows. They find out that they've got this funny thing that happened. And of course, it goes all over the office the next day. People look at the video. It turns out that that's a public official up there. So what happens the next day, do you imagine? They get a public disclosure request from a concerned citizen for all the video. So that's a pretty, other than the hyperbole around the couple, that's a fairly realistic scenario, and it illustrates a whole range of issues. So, Kevin, let me start with you. The license plates on the trailhead, that creates, at least couple of issues. I mean, this issue around can I fly drones and look at license plates and find out where people are, that's a big concern of the ACLU and of others. What, given the current state of the law, what responsibility does DNR have relative to the two different issues? One, they've captured personal information, and two, they've actually have enough information to demonstrate that somebody is breaking the law, right? They don't have a permit, they're walking on the trails aren't open. So these people on the, through this, what the industry calls incidental catch, I'm now, as a member of DNR, I'm kind of in a weird situation. Like what responsibility do I have, and what issues do I need to deal with?
Well, I guess, first of all, I think we're making an assumption that in every state that would be, what you've described would be personal information, because I'm not sure that given how personal information is described now and the states that have, data protection laws, that there would even be an issue with respect to that. But assuming that there are states that had that, the fact that it was captured from a drone, unless there was a particular law with regard to UAVs, really shouldn't matter. In terms of what they do with it, I'm not sure that you can necessarily say that just because someone's car is parked at a license, with a license plate in a parking lot, that they violated the law, right? So you can express the concerns, but I'm not sure it's gotten to the level where there's a legal issue involved. I looked at this a little bit differently when you gave us this hypothetical, because I think some of the issues, from an issue spotting standpoint, I would look at whether this was a state or a federal agency. In this hypothetical, it's a state. Mm-hmm. But as I described, federal agencies would have different requirements, so you would want to, given the executive memorandum, so you'd want to look at that. I think there's an interesting question about the use of video as compared to LiDAR, because there is a Supreme Court ruling that says, from a Fourth Amendment standpoint, that certain technologies are so unique that we have to worry about the privacy implications of that. Now, LiDAR was not one of those technologies that was addressed, but this case is over 15 years old. But there was a White House report, a big data report that came out in May of last year that talked about LiDAR, particularly associated with drones, that there may be privacy implications associated with that. The fact that a contractor's involved, so there's the commercial aspect, and what requirements that they have under state or federal law. So I think I'm deflecting the question, and that's kind of why I want to be a lawyer, but I think it's sort of there isn't necessarily right now, given the state of law, a direct answer, but those are some of the issues that you would want to look at as you think through the data that's collected, where you're sitting in the process, who you're going to share it with, and what the existing law is.
Just to add to that, I mean, I can tell you from having been in the guts of it, the fact that every state defines personal identifiable information differently ends up being one of the critical issues, because that is that's the discriminant for when you need to be private or not. So, Andrew, tell us from a technology perspective, that thing I just described, could it exist? Does it exist?
Technologically? Hello? Technologically, it could, but what's described in that example from a regulatory standpoint, in all likelihoods, would not be allowed for a few reasons. One, unless the Department of Natural Resources actually right now has what's called a certificate of waiver or authorization from the FAA to fly as a public agency, they couldn't. And I looked at the list of COAs before I came over here, and they may not be updated, but I don't think they do. So they would actually need explicit permission from the FAA right now in the absence of rules in order to fly. But a couple of other issues sort of come into play from a regulatory standpoint. One, there's some discussion about flying an 18-mile loop. A lot of the case-by-case exemptions right now, as well as the draft rules that are being contemplated by the FAA, really only allow for line of sight operations, which means if I'm flying a platform, I have to be able to see it. The minute I can't see it, it becomes, well, illegal, essentially. And that limits my range to maybe a half mile, maybe a mile, maybe a little bit longer if my eyesight's really, really, really good. But 18 miles wouldn't certainly be a possibility unless the regulatory framework allowed for beyond the line of sight operations. Beyond line of sight is a very, very sort of interesting puzzle, and it's going to be the next frontier in UAS integration, but it's an area that there are a whole host of issues, from how you integrate a platform that you can't see into the air traffic management system, and how it might operate autonomously, how you guide it, what are the command and control links, et cetera, et cetera. And this essentially is what Amazon would need if it were to ever make its package delivery service a reality. That may be a reality at some point. We're certainly not there under the existing case-by-case exemptions that allow both public agencies and some commercial operators to fly. We're certainly not there even under the draft rules that are being contemplated by the FAA, but one day we could potentially get there. And I guess the only other issue potentially is, we say hovering at a treetop level. Most of the flights right now have altitude limitations, at least with the draft rules that the FAA released. They're looking at a ceiling of 500 feet above ground level. So if it's a shorter tree, maybe. If it's a higher tree, maybe not. But from a technological standpoint, all of this is certainly doable. It's really the regulatory framework that would prohibit something like this from occurring.
So most of the laws are actually specific to unmanned aircraft. What's the difference? Why is there a difference between the scenario? Let's assume for a moment that the scenario I gave could exist. What are the differences between that scenario where you've got an unmanned aircraft with cameras versus a pilot flying a helicopter with a camera?
It's a good question. So there are federal aviation regulations that relate to unmanned aircraft, and what you can and can't do in an unmanned aircraft. I myself am a pilot, private pilot, just fly little Cessnas. I don't make a living doing that. I make a living helping folks like AUVSI. There are minimum altitude requirements for where you could fly. It's a little bit different in the manned context as opposed to unmanned. Unmanned, we're talking about no higher than 500 feet. In the manned context, in non-congested areas, in most cases, 500 feet is the lowest that you can fly.
Kevin, I'm going to interrupt for a second, and not from a regulatory perspective, but from a technology perspective and from a policy perspective. Give us your opinion. Is there a difference between a drone and a helicopter?
No. No, and from our AUVSI would contend that the real issue here are the cameras and the sensors, and you have to look at the activity of collecting data and sharing data, and it really shouldn't matter as to whether or not you're doing it with a manned helicopter or an unmanned drone.
So I'm going to take my moderator hat off here for a second. Huge difference, giant difference between a drone and a helicopter. And there's a couple of, one of them goes to what Kevin said before, a reasonable presumption of privacy. Mm-hmm. If that were a helicopter, the incidental catch of that couple in our example wouldn't have happened. I would have been able to hear a helicopter. It makes a big difference from a surveillance perspective. But more importantly, it's the economic difference. And this is the core of the debate that we certainly had at Washington. The one side of the debate says, you got to be technology independent. The issue, it doesn't matter if it's a helicopter or a satellite, all the issues are the same. The other side of the argument says, no way. Drones change the economics. And because they do, it's way cheaper. If I'm going to take the time to do that survey, I'm going to survey the entire side of that hill. I'm not going to survey just that 18-mile thing, because I can do it for a third what it would cost for the helicopter and the pilot. And I can gather tons and tons of data. Because it's way cheaper, there's going to be more of it, I'm going to use it more often, and I'm going to collect way more data. And the fear of that is one of the things that drove a bunch of decisions in the law. And it's, there's only two kinds of people in the world, right? The people who agree with you and the ones that don't. But that issue about, is the technology fundamentally different because of the economics, ends up being a really crucial dividing line.
I would argue that it's still an open question as to whether drones will result in a vast amount of new data being collected. I do agree that there will be new entities may be collecting the data, but instead of having sort of manned aircraft flying all over a state collecting data, you may just have updates on a periodic basis of particular areas where there's been change, right? Mm-hmm. Now you need to do a manned flight, and you need to pay for it, and since you're paying for it, you might as well fly the whole thing. You know, you could argue that it's going to be, you know, at the town level, right? That's going to go out and collect the information, and it's going to be much more, you know, insulated as to what you collect. So I think that's still an open question. The quality of the data may be better. You may be able to put sensors on there that as we develop smaller and smaller sensors, you may be able to collect, you know, at a millimeter or a few centimeters, if you will. Whether that impacts privacy, I think is still an open question, but that's part of what people are concerned about.
Right.
And I just want to jump in and say, you know, from I think the cost savings or cost efficiencies are a really good point. And I could see, you know, how it could factor into the debate about, well, they're cheaper, so there's going to be more of them. The flip side of that coin is, for a lot of public entities, because of the cost savings, you could do a lot of the same surveys that you once did with manned helicopters or manned airplanes, but you could do it cheaper and save taxpayers money. Just a couple of quick examples. So I've been out in, well, Washington State actually, with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which off the Olympic coast is using the Puma, which is a AeroVironment fixed-wing platform, to do seabird surveys and seal surveys and things that they used to do with helicopters, but now they're able to do them in a more cost-effective way because it costs a lot less to operate this little helicopter that you just kind of airplane that you hand launch. And when it's done, you kind of pitch it up, it stalls into the ocean, you go, you grab it, and you do it again, swap out the battery. I've also been out in Arizona with the Bureau of Land Management, again, more federal agencies than state, doing vegetation surveys near the U.S.-Mexico border. And they're actually using this old military UAS platform called the T-Hawk, which is kind of derisively referred to as the flying trash can. It is the loudest thing it is louder than a manned helicopter. So there's no hiding that particular one. You know, I think when you get into the issue of sort of the capabilities of platforms, the thing is they're not all you know, they're not all alike. There are some that if you fly them high enough could be quieter than a helicopter or an airplane, but if you fly them low enough could actually be louder. The T-Hawk is certainly really, you know, jacks up the decibel level in particular. But I do think, you know, importantly, I just wanted to say I think the cost savings of the technology is a huge selling point for public entities that want to do things, you know, for which they right now, it's a huge selling point as well for businesses for which they want to do things right now that they're using manned helicopters or airplanes for. The oil and gas industry in particular, surveying pipelines, other critical infrastructure, oil rigs is really, really excited about the possibility of using UAS or drones to do the same kind of work.
So, Kevin, let's talk about one of the other issues inherent in this, which is the DNR sent these sensors out to gather information for one purpose. They cared about LiDAR and trail conditions. Now, but they captured all this other information that may need law enforcement to be involved. So I'm not going to ask you about you know, how the state of the law on that, because it is this is a state-specific thing. It's one of the key things. It's another one of those giant discriminants. This is fundamentally a whole lot about law enforcement, and if you gather information for one reason, can you use it for law enforcement? So acknowledging that's a state issue, you're also an expert, and so I'm asking your opinion. Should the DNR be able to take that they found a marijuana grow, it's illegal. DNR has an enforcement arm. They have their own paramilitary police. Should the people who looked at the data tell the people on the other side of the agency that there's an illegal grow out there?
First, I'm surprised they have a paramilitary police.
Yeah, natural resources has broad enforcement power.
I guess the analysis that I would do is if a DNR agent was just walking the trailhead and saw the marijuana field, would he have the authority under law or policy or regulations to go back and say, hey, you know, there's an illegal marijuana field there, someone should check it out? I assume in most cases that would be true. The next sort of scenario I'd walk through is, okay, if he or she was walking along and they had a camera or some sort of, you know, sniffing device that would somehow be able to detect that, would they be able to go back and do that? That might be a little bit more subject to sort of Fourth Amendment at the federal level concerns. But if they could do that, I would argue that they should be able to, you know, do the same with UAVs. Now, if you were to find out that they sent this contractor out there knowing that, you know, in addition, you may want to keep an eye out for marijuana fields because we see someone out there, and that somehow violates, you know, the state constitution of search and seizure, you know, that's another situation. But if it was truly just out there and collecting the information and came across this, I believe that the law should treat that the same. I'm not sure we're at that. I'm not sure we're going to stay at that point.
I can tell you from being involved, that is another one of the crucial issues. If you gather the information, because most state agencies are going to gather the information for agriculture reasons or to count the number of trees for, you know, for timber estimations. But when they capture things that are illegal, should they, can they, what's the right policy to bring law enforcement? And, you know, it really is a public policy. The question is, do we want to live in an environment where I can surveil things for one reason and be punished for things based on that same surveillance?
Did you have a question?
Yeah, please.
Please
yell.
All right. So that happens now.
It does.
We got, you know, stationary cameras all over the state.
All
and
over?
everything that you said in your scenario, except for the pot, okay, because I think it's too humid in Alabama for us to grow it.
No, that's greenhouse.
You know, it's happened on some state camera somewhere. Okay?
Right.
As embarrassing as it is for me to have to admit that in front of all these people. And so, you know, the use case that you gave, I mean, you know, using the lidar for trail maintenance in a park like that, you know, there's nothing in the world that will do as good a job of that as flying that lidar with an unmanned aerial vehicle. Okay,
Right.
It's a better mousetrap. And so I think that, you know, we're at a real dangerous point right now where we all got to get on the same page about this, and we have to go forward. You know, and we may not agree on everything, but what we can agree on, and try to make sure that our voice is heard. Because, you know, states, counties, and cities need waypoint navigation, because this is a better tool for us, okay? And, you know, I think there's ways to work around all the privacy issues, but, you know, I really do think that's a holy grail for us. We had our GS conference last week, and I got hammered by all these people in ag and all these people that work in conservation. They're saying they're taking the ball out of our hands, and please stop them, don't let them do it.
I agree with everything you say, and 91% of the U.S. population says their personal data is out of whack, and therefore they want their legislators to do something about it. It's tricky. Please.
I'd be interested in knowing, your slide showed that your organization endorses registration of devices and of operators. What's your position on certification of operators from both the perspective of the FAA perspective of airspace and safety and the physical presence of the device in certain areas, and current initial and recurrent training on some of these other issues that go way beyond that, on policy and privacy and what the reasonable expectations are, what the regulations are, and then as an additional follow-on about the potential for geofencing to ensure enforcement.
Sure. I think it's a very, very good question. And right now, under the rules that have been proposed by the FAA, what the FAA is proposing is that operators will have to pass an aeronautical knowledge test every 2 years. So it would be some sort of level of recurrent training. And part of the reason for that is not so much training in how to fly the platform, but training in understanding the operating environment. How do you find an airport in your area and operate 5 miles away from it? How do you determine that you're not going to conflict with other manned traffic? So that's one element of the operator certification. We've actually been pleasantly surprised that what the FAA proposed is less onerous than we thought the requirements were going to be. And obviously we support any operator training in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions to make sure that they know how to operate the platform. One of the challenges with unmanned aircraft is, we could be talking about a 1-pound styrofoam drone that, if it falls to the floor, well, nothing's going to happen. You pick it right up and, fly it, and even if it bumped you on the head, it's not going to do anything. So, or we could be talking about, a 54.9-pound platform that goes right up to that 55-pound threshold, for which there's a greater, safety risk if something goes wrong, and for which you need more training in order to fly. And because there are so many different platforms, the FAA at this juncture really can't prescribe a different training method for every single one. What they're doing is relying on the manufacturers to provide training instructions. But also the other issue here too is, at least for commercial operators, a lot of this is probably going to be driven by the insurance industry and what insurers require in order to, and this is something we see play out in the manned aviation world all the time. I'm a private pilot. The FAA tells me I have to undergo a biennial flight review every 24 months. Basically repeat my FAA driver's test, where they put you through the paces for 6 hours and make sure you know how to do all the maneuvers that you need to do. Well, in order to be insured under my policy says, actually, we want you to do it every year. So there's what the FAA prescribes. There's what the manufacturers prescribe, and I think one of the things that we're going to see here is the insurance industry in particular is also going to drive operator training and certification, particularly for commercial operators, in order to be covered under certain policies. I'm sorry, was there a second part of the question?
In terms of the other side of the training, in terms of the privacy issues and the issues beyond the FAA.
Right, okay. In terms of privacy training, there's nothing, to my knowledge, in the FAA rules that require any kind of policy training. Obviously, they would require that any platform would have to be operated in accordance with any state or local laws, but it would really be incumbent upon the individual operator to know what those are and to follow them. The FAA, and Michael mentioned this earlier, the FAA views its mission as safety, first and foremost. The FAA is in charge of the safety of the airspace and making sure that things don't run into each other, whether it's 2 manned airplanes, 2 drones, or a drone in a commercial airliner. So, and that really is the FAA's expertise. It's been the FAA's mission for decades and decades. So that's why, even though that there's a call for the FAA to take on the privacy issues and a lawsuit, as Kevin mentioned, the FAA is really focused on safety and making sure that the integration occurs in a manner that doesn't cause safety risks and is done in a safe and responsible way.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, I think the privacy concerns, I don't think most commercial operators are going to be the ones who are actually flying it. They're going to be focused on flying, right? So they're not going. The privacy concerns is going to come with the data that's collected and how it's used downstream. So I think it kind of makes sense that the FAA hasn't included that in their training certification process, because they probably don't see that. I mean, I think the real operator privacy concerns are your creepy neighbor, right, who's trying to use it to look in through a window, and the FAA isn't, they're not going to go through certification training to do that. So I don't think that's going to be something that the FAA is going to worry about for the reasons that Andrew said. It's going to be when the data is collected, sent back, and shipped to someone else, and they start looking at it, processing, and analyzing it.
So we're, excuse me, we're almost out of time. Yeah,
Can I just say one thing real quick? I appreciate what the state official from Alabama said. This reminds me of the debate a decade ago about RFID, when everybody was slight hysteria and wanted to regulate and outlaw and prohibit the use of RFID. So it's important that we pause and not take a step to regulate something that doesn't necessarily, and an emerging technology that's, you know, not proven to be a problem.
Agreed. Yeah, please.
So I think you did a really great job of convincing me that we've got another year or two, all of us, of this anticipatory and hypothetical legislation, you know, policy making to play out. So my question would be, you know, I mean, I don't mean to make light of it, right? These are pretty thorny issues, and candidly, they're going to be above the pay grade of the state CIO, right? No one's going to delegate that to people in this room. It's going to play out in our various state legislatures in the governor's office. So if we look forward 2 or 3 years, what would be delegated down possibly to like the state CIO's office to be setting policy on? What issues would kind of remain that wouldn't get sorted out by state statute?
I think that's a great question, and my guess on that, well, first of all, my experience with our legislature is that they don't let somebody else sort it all out. They just make arbitrary and capricious decisions, and then you have to implement them. But, you know, part of the reason why the public policy won't all get delegated down, the implementation of that policy will get delegated down, and it'll look like you need to come up with data minimization policies for all of the agencies. You need to come up with policies about, or either you or agencies, and then it'll be your responsibility to make sure that that the policies are exposed. But policies about identifying to the public when drones are going to fly, what kind of information they're collecting. Those are all things that, at least the legislation that I've seen, those are the issues that they end up specifying. And it turned, to me anyway, it seems like kind of a strange thing in that what they're really trying to do is solve this big issue about we're afraid, that people are afraid. But all they can do is make laws about specific technologies and the ramifications of those specific technologies. So it's going to be, your job is going to be weird. Please.
You had a response before I ask a question? Okay.
Yeah, the legislation that I followed, I think there's going to be, the challenge is going to be at the level that you're talking about, is you're going to have this one set of data that's likely to be, you're required to treat differently than other data types. And without any thought about how to do that, why to do that, and how are you going to serve your mission when you've got this data that's going to be treated differently. My argument would be that that's going to make it harder for you. Are you going to have to store it differently? Are you going to have to get people to sign off on it differently? Are you going to have to get a different permission to use it? And so I don't see any of those really being thought through in state legislation, but from a practical standpoint, the way data moves and is used, it seems to me that someone within the state is going to have to be dealing with that.
One other thing before, to answer your question, there are probably 2 other just full-on technologies that this is going to matter in. One of them is video redaction. Automated video redaction is an extraordinarily hard problem, and government is really the only ones, not the only ones, but the primary customer for it. So it's going to be hard to find a lot of vendors who are going to try and address that complex problem of not just how do I redact video, but how do I know when I need to? In what regulatory context am I? Is this HIPAA data? Is this, what are all the rules around it? And the other one is compression, video compression, and the problems around storing it are going to be huge.
So my question is just a slight variation of what Steve asked, and you already answered some of it. So RFID, Internet of Things, body cameras, all these technologies we were talking about, all of them have come, and we are trying to figure out how we deal with that. This is coming. I mean, either we do it in this room, or whether somebody at the Emergency Management Agency or state police or someone else does it, it's going to happen. And the legislation's also going to come in the next 2 to 3 years, hypothetically. What can the state CIOs do to be prepared? You talked about the video redaction and the compression. But in general, I mean, to be ahead of this, as opposed to being reactionary to our emergency management colleagues.
My answer to that question is really A, get educated on this set of issues that we're talking about, and B, educate your legislators, right? Because the things that are driving this movement in state legislation don't really have much to do with the technology, but what they're doing is choosing to regulate the technology. And I think education would solve that problem. So educate yourself and make sure that you're available to explain to the legislators why why isolating aircraft is a relevant thing to do in law, when what they're really trying to do is protect the way government collects and deals with personal data. Because from a technology perspective, they're disconnected, but they're getting tied together in legislation.
I think this one, he's good.
Yeah, please.
To that very point, how can we parlay this discussion and this fervor to cybersecurity? Because that deserves a lot more attention than the privacy to this specific technology and the specific tool. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts how through that education, or how we can say, hey, if you're so worried about this, how about this?
I would say don't try. Well, for a couple different reasons. The way I view it, security is the parlance of technologists. Privacy is the parlance of lawyers. Security has a completely different set of constituents, set of issues, set of things that they have to care about. Privacy has 120 years of jurisprudence that's driving it. They're very different issues. Separate them as much as possible, and there's room and a need for both. So I would love to take questions till the cows come home, but there's a big wrap-up sign going on here. So let me just ask one thing. If you're here 3 years ago, or 3 years from now, really briefly, how is this conversation different? And I'll answer that first to give you a second to think about it. What's going to be different is we're going to get over that last issue. People are going to realize the crux of this issue is about collecting people's private data, what you do with it, how you maintain it, how you minimize it, how you redact it. And it will be, right now, drones are the flashpoint for those, but there's nothing specific about unmanned aerial vehicles that is relevant to the core problem that our people are asking us to solve. So we won't be talking about technology when we'll continue to talk about privacy, but it'll be technology independent in 3 years. Kevin?
I think that in 3 years from now, you're going to see the conversation evolve to the sensor and the type of data that people want to start using, and how can you use it, and whether it be privacy. Intellectual property rights is something that I think is a hurdle that we're going to have to overcome. People are going to start thinking about what are people doing with that data, not just from a privacy standpoint, but that's my data. Why are you making money from it? Why are you using it in different ways? So I think that's an area. But I think it's new technology that's going to be put on drones used in different ways, but not just drones. As Michael said, it's going to be other platforms that are going to be collecting this data, whether it be your smartphone to do even LiDAR, right? So I think it's going to be more of a discussion around sensors and data than platforms, quite frankly.
I think we're going to see some of the fear and sensationalism begin to subside, and the public perception of the technology begin to improve. And the reason I say that is because presumably we'll have FAA rules in place that allow many commercial operators and public entities to just go out and fly. And the more people are familiar with something, the less fearful it is. And I think the open question, and we're already seeing, by the way, over the past 3 years or so, public perception ticking in the right direction. It's nowhere near where it needs to be, but Monmouth University in New Jersey puts out a poll almost every year where they kind of take the public's temperature, and they found that 82% of the public support using drones for search and rescue. 2/3 support using drones for border patrol and immigration. Interestingly, only 27% support using drones for catching speeders, which I understand because as somebody with a lead foot, I don't know that I want that either. But I think as the public sees the technology being used, it's going to become less scary. I think the open question is, are states and legislatures going to put in place restrictive legislation before we get to that point? And I hope the answer is no.
Kevin, Andrew, thank you for your time and your input. Please join me in thanking them as well.
So I think that's a classic case of, we can be at the table or we may be on the menu. So we either get engaged with this or we start to pay attention to it, and all the data management and all the privacy and all the security issues around it. We need to be able to make sure that we're articulating a consistent message when that comes up. So I do have a real quick couple of last questions for everyone. Before we gather in Salt Lake City for the NASCIO annual conference, what will be your front burner issue? Selling more stuff to the state CIOs, cybersecurity and risk management, advancing our IT consolidation initiatives, planning to deal with state IT workforce retirements, executing on our new state budget, or just chilling? Seems apropos for Salt Lake City.
He was born in the summer of his 27th year, coming home to a place
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'll know to wear a flak jacket when I go there then. So I would have thought there'd be more after a long week of a couple of days anyways of just chilling. But another question for everybody, will you be joining us in Salt Lake City for the 2015 annual conference, yes or no? And maybe. Yeah, I like that. To work on those no's, because it's only 66%. That's not bad. All right. So I'd like to remind everybody of the upcoming awards program. Submission for the 2015 State IT Recognition Awards are due June 1st. State CIOs, don't forget to nominate your state CISO for the Thomas M. Jarrett Annual Conference Scholarship. Nominations open May 11th and are due June 22nd. Please take time to complete the survey. As you well know, the conference evaluation is really how we make these programs better. And with that, I would like to thank the program committee. They did a great job again, as always. I'd like to thank the sponsors. Appreciate your support. I'd like to thank NASCIO's team. They did an excellent job. And of course, the CIOs. I appreciate that very much. And you guys continue to do a great job and make us look good. We also have another round of Twitter winners. If your name is on the screen, please stop by the registration booth and pick up your gift to collect your prize. So state members, the business meeting starts at 5 o'clock in the terrace room right across the hallway down there. We'll try to make that a quick meeting. At least I would like to make it a quick meeting. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending the NASCIO Midyear. We look forward to see you in Salt Lake City. Thank you.